The sound of the engine filled the silence inside the car as Rebecca Sloan drove through the city. It was late afternoon, and traffic was starting to pile up on the main avenues. The routine of being a lawyer had always been demanding, but in recent months it felt even heavier. Between endless hearings and anxious clients, she rarely had time to breathe, let alone reflect on her life. The red lights were almost a relief. They offered a pause, a moment to turn off the autopilot. It was during one of those moments, stopped at a busy traffic light, that Rebecca saw him. A young man was walking between the cars, balancing a basket full of red roses. He was offering flowers to the drivers with a faint smile, but Rebecca wasn't focused on the flowers. Her eyes were fixed on his face. He had features that seemed disconcertingly familiar, the same tousled brown hair, the same slightly defiant posture, and something in his expression that made her heart race. Rebecca squinted, trying to understand what was causing the tightness in her chest. That's when something on his wrist caught her attention. A watch. It wasn't just any watch. The classic design, with a black leather strap and distinctive face, was unmistakable. Rebecca felt the world spin. She immediately remembered Richard, her boyfriend who had passed away over 2 decades ago. She had chosen that watch as a birthday gift for him, a rare model he wore every day. Richard had been wearing that watch on the day he died. Her breath caught in her throat. She blinked a few times, thinking she was imagining things, but the watch was there, gleaming under the setting sun. Memories came flooding back like an avalanche. She remembered the day she gave the watch to Richard, how he used to twist the strap when he was deep in thought. It was impossible for that young man to be wearing the same watch. And yet, he was. The light was about to turn green, but Rebecca rolled down her window. "Hey," she called, her voice louder than she had expected. The young man approached, his curious eyes fixing on her as he balanced the basket of flowers. "Would you like a rose, ma'am?" he asked, his tone polite but indifferent. Rebecca ignored the question, pointing at his wrist. "That watch, where did you get it?" The young man frowned, confused. He glanced at the watch quickly, as if it were an ordinary object. "It's mine," he replied, clearly unsettled. "Would you like to buy a rose, maybe?" Rebecca reached out to grab his arm. "Please, tell me where you got it. It's very important." Her voice now brimmed with emotion, a mix of urgency and disbelief. The young man pulled back, visibly startled. He yanked his arm away, clutching the basket tighter. "I'm just selling roses," he said before turning and running to the sidewalk, disappearing among pedestrians and parked cars. The sound of honking behind her snapped her back to reality. The light had turned green, and the drivers were growing impatient. Rebecca glanced around, searching for the young man, but he was already gone. Reluctantly, she stepped on the gas, following the flow of traffic, though her mind was miles away. Back at her apartment, Rebecca was restless. She opened a bottle of wine, poured some into a glass, and sat on the couch. The watch wouldn't leave her mind. How could that young man have it? He seemed so young, he couldn't have known Richard. Still, his resemblance to her late boyfriend was unsettling. Rebecca grabbed her laptop and typed the watch model into a search engine. It was a rare piece, a limited edition, almost impossible to find these days. She clicked through several images, but none of them had the same impact as the watch on the young man's wrist. It was the one. It had to be. She closed the laptop and leaned back, shutting her eyes. The memories she had buried for so long began to resurface. She remembered Richard, his easy smile, the way he made her laugh at the most unexpected moments, the promise of a life together. All of it ended on the same day she lost the baby. The same day she received the news that Richard had died in an accident on his way to the hospital. For years, Rebecca had convinced herself that overcoming that pain was impossible. Instead, she locked it away in a drawer in the back of her mind and moved on, building her career and dedicating herself to work. But now, something that seemed so distant was coming back to the surface. She looked at her phone, thinking about calling Anna, her friend and coworker. Anna was the only person who knew how much Rebecca had suffered in the past, but even with her, Rebecca rarely mentioned Richard or the baby. Perhaps it was better to let it go, to convince herself it was a coincidence. But the thought of leaving it behind felt impossible. "Who are you?" she whispered to herself, thinking of the young man with the watch. And how he was connected to Richard. Rebecca didn't sleep that night. Instead, she made a silent promise to herself: she would find him again. And she would uncover the truth, no matter the cost. The watch seemed to have imprinted itself on Rebecca's mind like an echo that wouldn't fade. Throughout the previous night, she had relived that moment at the traffic light, the sight of the young man, the confusion on his face, and above all, the unmistakable gleam of the watch on his wrist. An object she had believed was lost forever. The next day, Rebecca tried to focus on work. Stacks of documents awaited her review, but no matter how hard she tried, her mind kept drifting back to the young man and the watch. Each detail seemed clearer with every memory: the classic design, the way he gestured while holding the roses, the way he ran when she tried to ask him questions. During her coffee break, Rebecca decided to confide in someone. She found Anna, her friend and confidant, in the office lounge. Anna was a practical and rational woman, always ready to balance Rebecca's obsessions with doses of reality. "Anna, I need to tell you something," Rebecca began, holding her coffee cup like a shield. "Yesterday, in traffic, I saw a young man selling roses. He was wearing Richard's watch." Anna frowned in surprise. "Richard's watch? The one you gave him as a gift?" Rebecca nodded, her voice growing intense. "Yes. There's no mistaking it. It's a rare model, with a unique design. And Richard's initials are engraved on the back." Anna leaned forward, intrigued but skeptical. "Rebecca, that was 2 decades ago. How could someone have that watch now? It's more likely just a coincidence." "Coincidence?" Rebecca shook her head. "How can it be a coincidence? I would recognize that watch anywhere." Anna sighed, taking a sip of her tea. "Look, I understand why this shook you. But what if it's not what you want to hear? Maybe the watch was lost or sold by someone who found it. What do you hope to discover, Rebecca?" Rebecca looked out the lounge window, where the morning light streamed in golden beams. "I don't know what I expect to find. But something about that young man felt familiar. He looks like Richard. And the watch. I need to understand how he got it." Anna watched Rebecca for a moment, trying to gauge whether to encourage or dissuade her. Finally, she said, "If this is bothering you that much, maybe you should investigate. Just be careful, Rebecca. The past might not be the easiest place to revisit." Rebecca nodded, knowing Anna was right, but her determination only grew. It wasn't just about the watch. Something deep inside her told her that young man was the key to answers she didn't even know she was looking for. That evening, Rebecca drove to the intersection where she had encountered the young man. The traffic was heavier than the day before, the lights of the cars illuminating the streets with a flickering glow. She parked on a side street and walked to the traffic light, her eyes scanning for the basket of red roses or any sign of the young man. Minutes turned into hours. Other vendors came and went, a man offering balloons, a woman selling boxes of candy. But there was no sign of the young man. Rebecca examined each face with rising hope, only to feel disappointment growing with every moment. The cold wind bit at her skin, and she pulled her coat tighter around her body. As she waited, doubts began to creep in. What if Anna was right? What if she was chasing a ghost, something her mind had invented as a way to cope with the pain of the past? But even with those doubts, she couldn't give up. Something about that watch, about that brief exchange of glances with the young man, called to her. Rebecca stayed at the intersection late into the night, but he didn't appear. Back in her car, she sighed in frustration. It wasn't the first time her determination had led her to ignore logic, but this time it felt deeper. As she drove home, she made a silent promise: she would return to that intersection as many times as it took. And when she found him, she wouldn't let him escape without giving her answers. Rebecca woke up early the next day, but the restlessness of the night had not eased her mind. Instead, the doubts and questions seemed even more intense. As she prepared a cup of coffee, memories of Richard began flooding her thoughts, as if her mind insisted on reliving the past. Richard Grant had been everything to her. They had met in college, both young and full of dreams and ambitions. Rebecca remembered how he always made her laugh at the most unexpected moments, how he seemed to see beyond the walls she built around herself. He was the kind of person who lit up any room. They had started building a life together, and when they found out they were going to be parents, Rebecca felt that the world was finally a perfect place. She closed her eyes and allowed herself to return to the moment she had given him the watch. It had been Richard's birthday, and they were in a small, cozy restaurant. He unwrapped the gift with a playful smile, but upon seeing the watch, his expression changed to something deeper. "It's perfect, Rebecca," he had said, holding the watch as if it were the most precious thing in the world. "Thank you." He had worn that watch every day since then. And it was on his wrist the day he rushed to the hospital when Rebecca went into labor. The day that changed everything. Rebecca still felt the pain as if it had happened yesterday. The delivery was difficult, and when she woke up from the anesthesia, she heard the words that would echo in her mind forever, "I'm sorry, but the baby didn't survive." She barely had time to process the news before receiving another. Richard had been in an accident on his way to the hospital. He didn't make it. It was the worst kind of nightmare, the kind that takes everything away at once. Losing Richard and the baby on the same day was like losing a part of herself. Rebecca spent months engulfed in grief, but somehow, she found the strength to carry on. She went back to work, dedicating herself to her career as a lawyer with an almost obsessive intensity. Not because she wanted to, but because she had to. Work was the only thing that kept her standing. But the watch was never found. And now, 20 years later, it had reappeared on the wrist of an unknown young man. A young man who looked so much like Richard that it was almost impossible to ignore. That afternoon, Rebecca returned to the intersection, determined to find the young man again. This time, she brought a bottle of water and a book to help her pass the time. She sat on a nearby bench and watched the movement around her. Traffic flowed, vendors passed with balloons and candy, but there was no sign of him. Then, as if fate were testing her patience, she saw him. Ethan, with the basket of roses, moving quickly between the cars. Rebecca felt her heart race, but she took a deep breath, promising herself that this time, she wouldn't scare him away. When he finally stopped to rest near the sidewalk, she approached him slowly, not wanting to frighten him like before. "Hi," she said, trying to sound calm. Ethan looked at her, clearly wary. "You again? I already told you I didn't do anything." Rebecca raised her hands in a gesture of surrender. "I know. I'm not here for that. I just want to talk. About the watch." He frowned, clutching the basket tightly. "Why are you so obsessed with this watch?" "It's mine. My grandfather gave it to me. I don't know why you're so fixated on it." Rebecca took a deep breath, carefully choosing her words. "It's because I recognize that watch, Ethan. It's not just any object. It belonged to my boyfriend, Richard. He died 20 years ago, and he was wearing that watch the day he died." Ethan shook his head, crossing his arms. "You're mistaken, ma'am. This watch is a family heirloom. My grandfather gave it to me on my 18th birthday. He said it was special, but he never mentioned anything about someone else. It's mine, it always has been." Rebecca stepped closer, looking directly at him. "Have you ever looked at the back? Have you seen the engraving?" Ethan hesitated, his distrust now mixed with curiosity. "Engraving? What engraving?" "There's something engraved on the back," Rebecca said, her voice low but firm. "The initials RG, Richard Grant. My boyfriend's initials. If you don't believe me, check for yourself." Ethan stared at her for a moment, the doubt clearly written on his face. Reluctantly, he took off the watch and turned it over. He was silent for a few seconds, his eyes fixed on the small metal surface where the initials were engraved. RG, he murmured, as if the world around him had stopped. He looked at Rebecca, now confused. But, how is that possible? My grandfather never mentioned anyone named Richard. He said this watch was part of our family. Rebecca felt a wave of emotion but remained composed. I don't know how it happened, Ethan. But I know that watch belonged to Richard. I gave it to him as a gift myself. Ethan held the watch with trembling hands, staring at the engraving on the back. RG, he murmured again, as if trying to decipher the meaning behind those letters. He looked at Rebecca, still confused, but now with a hint of belief in his eyes. If this was your boyfriend's, how did my grandfather get it? He never said anything about this. I don't know, Rebecca admitted honestly. But if anyone can help us understand this, it's your mother. Please, Ethan, let me talk to her. Ethan hesitated, closing the watch carefully and putting it back on his wrist. He ran his fingers over the basket of roses, clearly struggling with confusion and skepticism. Finally, he sighed. My mother is sick, you know? She can barely get out of bed. I don't like to bother her. I promise I'll only ask what's necessary, Rebecca said gently. I don't want to cause her any stress. But this is important. For both of us. Ethan frowned, considering. I can take you to her, but not now. I need to finish selling these flowers. The money. I need it to help my mom. Rebecca looked at the basket of roses and then back at Ethan. How much do you usually make selling these flowers? Ethan shrugged. Not much. But it's what we have. Without hesitation, Rebecca opened her purse and pulled out a large bill, handing it to him. I'll buy them all. Ethan's eyes widened in surprise. All of them? But you don't even need them. Rebecca smiled, a bit sadly. I need answers more than flowers. Please, Ethan, take me to your mother. For a moment, Ethan stood still, as if processing her gesture. Finally, he took the money, albeit reluctantly. All right, he said, adjusting the basket on his arm. I can take you now. But I don't know what you expect to find. Neither do I, Rebecca admitted honestly. But I hope your mother knows something that can help us. Ethan nodded, turning to walk down the sidewalk. Rebecca followed him, carrying with her a mix of anxiety and hope. She knew that answers were closer than ever, but she also feared what she might find. The walk to Ethan's house was short, but the silence along the way felt heavy, stretching the distance like miles. Rebecca followed the young man through narrow streets, watching his stiff posture as he clutched the now empty basket of roses. Ethan walked quickly, as if wanting to get it over with. Rebecca, on the other hand, felt every step as an advance toward the unknown. They arrived at an old building with faded paint and worn concrete steps. Ethan opened the door without a word, motioning for Rebecca to follow him down a narrow hallway to a small apartment on the second floor. The air was thick with the smell of medicine and freshly brewed tea, and the simple living room was filled with well-worn but cared-for furniture. A heavy silence enveloped the space. My mom's in the bedroom, Ethan said, avoiding Rebecca's eyes. She's weak, but she can talk a little. Rebecca nodded and followed him. When she entered the bedroom, she saw a woman with gray hair lying on a simple bed, surrounded by pillows. She was thin, with sunken eyes, but her expression was still warm. Her lips curled into a faint smile when she saw Ethan. Hi, my son, Ellie said, her voice weak but welcoming. You brought company? She wants to talk to you, Mom, Ethan replied hesitantly. He pulled a chair closer for Rebecca and stood beside the bed, still holding the empty basket as if it were a shield. Rebecca sat down, searching for the right words. Hello, Ellie, she began, her voice softer than she expected. My name is Rebecca Sloan. I know this is an unexpected visit, but there's something I need to understand, something about Ethan's watch. Ellie looked at her son's wrist, where the watch was now hidden under his sleeve. Her brow furrowed, confusion evident in her eyes. The watch? What about it? It belonged to my boyfriend, Rebecca continued, her voice gaining strength. Richard Grant. He died 20 years ago. And that watch was with him when he died. The room fell silent. Ellie looked at Ethan, then back at Rebecca, before letting out a deep sigh. I knew this day would come, she said, her tone resigned. Ethan frowned, crossing his arms. Mom, what is she talking about? Grandpa gave me this watch. He said it was his. Ellie closed her eyes for a moment, as if gathering the strength to speak. I never had the courage to tell you, Ethan. Because the truth is painful. She looked at Rebecca, her eyes full of regret. It was my father. He was a nurse at the hospital where you were born, Ethan. He was there that night, when everything happened. Rebecca felt her body tense. When everything happened? What do you mean? Ellie took a deep breath, as if each word were a struggle. That night, my father was working at the hospital, during a particularly difficult shift. My family was falling apart. My baby had just been born, but he didn't survive. Her voice faltered, but she pressed on. I was devastated. My father, he wanted to spare me that pain. So, he swapped the babies. Ethan took a step back, his face pale. What? Ellie began to cry, tears streaming down her tired face. He brought you to me, Ethan. He said you were my son, but you're not. He took you from your real mother. Rebecca felt the words like a punch, an echo that reverberated through her mind. You're saying Ethan is my son? Her voice was louder than she had expected, filled with shock and disbelief. Ellie nodded slowly, unable to meet Rebecca's gaze. Your baby was declared dead, Rebecca. But he was alive. And he's Ethan. Ethan shook his head, taking another step back. No, that doesn't make sense. Grandpa loved me. He would never do something like that. He gave me this watch. He said it was from our family. Ellie sobbed, guilt etched into every word. He took the watch, after Richard's accident. He overheard the nurses and paramedics talking, saying Richard was the father of the baby he brought to me. I think, in some way, he knew Ethan would grow up without answers. So he kept the watch, maybe as a symbol, something for Ethan to have if he ever learned the truth. The silence that followed was dense, each person processing Ellie's words in their own way. Rebecca was torn between the overwhelming joy of discovering that Ethan was her son and the pain of knowing he had been stolen from her. Ethan seemed frozen, confusion and anger battling for control of his mind. I'm so sorry, Ellie said, looking at Rebecca with tearful eyes. I never knew how to fix this. I loved Ethan as my son, but I always knew he wasn't mine. Rebecca took a deep breath, trying to process what she had heard. You're a victim, too, she said finally, her voice trembling. I can see that. But this is a lot to take in. Ethan said nothing. He left the room abruptly, closing the door behind him. Rebecca looked at Ellie, but there were no more questions she could ask at that moment. The silence in the room was filled only with Ellie's sobs. The hallway felt narrower as Ethan walked, his steps hurried and uneven, until he reached the living room. He let the basket of roses drop onto the couch and sat in a nearby chair, his mind spinning like a storm. Ellie's words echoed in his head, you were swapped. Rebecca is your real mother. Nothing felt real, but at the same time, it all made a strange kind of sense. He looked at the watch on his wrist. That object, which he had always thought was just a family heirloom, now seemed too heavy to wear. Ethan removed it and placed it on the table in front of him, fixing his gaze on it as though the watch could answer the flood of questions overwhelming him. For years, Ethan had believed that his life, however hard it was, had a solid foundation. Ellie was his mother, and his grandfather, despite being stern, had been a pillar in his childhood. Now, learning that everything had been built on a lie made him question everything. Who was he, really? Ethan closed his eyes, recalling the simple days of his childhood. He had always been close to Ellie, especially after his grandfather passed away. She was a devoted mother who did everything she could to care for him, even as her health began to decline. But his grandfather. Ethan thought about how the man had always been reserved, a man of few words and calculated actions. The idea that his grandfather could have done something so extreme left him conflicted. He loved and respected the man, but now he felt anger and betrayal. How could he have stolen Ethan from his real mother? And the watch? Why keep a secret that he must have known would one day surface? He also thought of the struggles. The poverty, the abandonment by his adoptive father, the constant fight to support Ellie. He had always believed that his mother's love and dedication made up for the hardships. But now, who was his real mother? And how was he supposed to feel about her? Rebecca opened the door slowly and found Ethan still sitting in the chair, staring at the watch. She entered cautiously, taking a seat on the couch nearby. For a moment, she didn't say anything. She just observed him. "I don't know what to think," Ethan finally said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "My whole life was a lie." Rebecca swallowed hard. "It wasn't a lie, Ethan. Ellie loved you, and I can see that. She gave you everything she could. That doesn't erase what happened, but she's not the villain in this story." Ethan shook his head, his eyes still fixed on the watch. "I love my mom. I always will. But how did this happen? How could Grandpa do this? And you? Do you really believe I'm your son?" Rebecca felt the weight of the question and took a deep breath before answering. "I don't believe it, Ethan. I know it. When I saw you at that intersection, something inside me told me. You look so much like Richard. And the watch. But more than that, my heart knows." Ethan looked at her for the first time since she entered the room. There was pain in his eyes, but also a flicker of hope. "And now," he asked, "what do I do now?" Rebecca smiled, a sad but sincere smile. "We figure it out together. If you want to. I don't want to take you away from Ellie, but I want to be part of your life. I want to help you understand who you are, and I want you to know you'll always have a place with me." Ethan remained silent for a long moment before nodding. "She needs you in there," he said, looking away. "She's getting worse. And even after all this, she's still my mom." Rebecca stood, placing a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "And she always will be. I promise." In the bedroom, Ellie seemed more fragile than before, as though the revelation had drained what little strength she had left. Rebecca sat beside the bed and held Ellie's hand, feeling her cold, frail skin. "I'm so sorry," Ellie said, tears streaming down her face. "If I had the strength, I would have told you sooner. But I was scared. Scared of losing him." Rebecca squeezed her hand more firmly. "I'm not going to take him from you. You're just as much a victim of this as I am. You cared for him, gave him everything you had. That's love." Ellie sobbed, guilt written across her expression. "Do you forgive me?" Rebecca hesitated for a moment but already knew the answer deep down. "Yes. I forgive you. We can't change the past, but we can do what's best going forward. For him." Ellie nodded, the tears still falling. "Thank you. Thank you for this." Ethan entered the room shortly after, standing beside Rebecca. He looked at Ellie and then at Rebecca, as though seeing both women in a new light. "I still don't know how to deal with this," he admitted, his voice trembling. "But I'll try." Ellie smiled, a small but relieved smile. "That's all I could ever ask for." Rebecca placed her hand on Ethan's shoulder, feeling the gravity of the moment. For the first time in a long while, she felt that something lost was beginning to be restored. The apartment was quiet the next morning, except for the sound of a kettle on the stove and the occasional creak of the wooden floor. Rebecca sat at the small kitchen table, watching Ethan as he moved slowly, preparing tea for Ellie. His face still carried the weight of the emotional storm from the night before, but there was something different about him, a quiet resolve, as though he had decided to move forward despite the turmoil within. Rebecca knew it wouldn't be easy for any of them. Ethan needed time to process everything, and Ellie, so fragile, had little time left to offer. But Rebecca was there, determined to do her part. "Have you been sleeping?" Rebecca asked softly. Ethan glanced at her, shaking his head. Not much. I still don't know how to feel. It's strange to think that my whole life. I thought I knew who I was. Rebecca nodded in understanding. I felt the same way. I spent 20 years thinking my child was gone. And now you're here. It's like a miracle, but it's also hard to process. Ethan set the cup of tea on the table and sat down, looking at her. Do you really think this can work? Us, trying to be something, a family? Rebecca took a deep breath. I think it's going to take time. But what matters is that we're trying. And you don't have to choose between me and Ellie. She will always be your mom, too. Ethan looked down, his fingers tracing the outline of the cup. I want to try, he said finally. But I don't know how this works. Rebecca smiled. Neither do I. But we can figure it out together. Over the following days, Rebecca began visiting the apartment more frequently, helping Ethan care for Ellie. Each day, she and Ethan found ways to connect, whether it was discussing details of his childhood or listening to Rebecca share stories about Richard. Ethan, initially guarded, began to relax, letting Rebecca into his world. Ellie, in turn, seemed to find a sense of peace in the new dynamic. Though her health continued to decline, her eyes lit up whenever she saw Rebecca and Ethan together. I knew you two needed each other, she said during a moment of clarity. Even though it took time, maybe this is how it was meant to be. Rebecca decided to do more than just offer emotional support. After consulting a doctor, she spoke with Ethan about Ellie's care. I want to help, she said. I can cover the costs of her treatment. I want to make sure she gets everything she needs. Ethan hesitated. Rebecca, that's a lot. I don't want you to think I'm taking advantage. It's not that, Ethan, she replied. This isn't about guilt or debt. It's because I want to be part of your life. I want to help you and Ellie have the best care possible. Ethan nodded, reluctant but grateful. Thank you. Bit by bit, Ethan started to reorganize his life. With Rebecca's help, he looked for a more stable job, something that would allow him to support Ellie without relying on selling flowers. He eventually found a position at a small flower shop downtown, where he could use his experience and passion for floral arrangements. The work was simple but gave Ethan a sense of purpose. One evening, after dinner, Rebecca sat next to Ethan in the small living room. You know, she said, looking at the watch on his wrist, Richard would have been proud of you. He was strong, just like you. Ethan looked at the watch, smiling softly. I don't remember him, but I feel like he's part of me. It's strange, but comforting. Rebecca placed a hand on his shoulder. He is part of you. And you are part of me. On Ellie's last day, the small apartment was filled with a solemn calm. Ethan sat by her side, holding her hand, while Rebecca stood nearby. Ellie opened her eyes with difficulty, smiling at the two of them. I'm at peace, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Because you're together now. Ethan kissed her hand, tears streaming down his face. I love you, Mom. I love you too, my son, Ellie replied, looking at Rebecca. Thank you, for everything. Rebecca felt tears welling up as she held Ellie's other hand. Thank you for taking care of him, Ellie. He's amazing because of you. Ellie closed her eyes for the last time, a faint smile on her face, surrounded by those who loved her. The sun shone gently through the windows of the small flower shop where Ethan worked, filling the space with a comforting warmth. It was a quiet morning, and he was arranging a bouquet for a regular customer. His hands, steady and careful, handled each stem with precision, creating a vibrant arrangement. He loved this job. It was simple, yet meaningful, much like the life he was beginning to rebuild. The shop door opened, and Rebecca walked in, smiling as she saw Ethan busy at work. He glanced at her and gave a small nod, a gesture filled with familiarity and comfort. You're getting good at this, she teased, walking toward the counter. Practice, Ethan replied with a grin. And maybe a little talent. They both laughed, and for a moment, everything felt normal, as though the turbulence of the past months was a distant memory. In many ways, it was. Ellie's passing had left a void, but it also brought a sense of peace. Ethan knew he had done everything he could for her, and that was enough to help him move forward. Later that day, Ethan and Rebecca walked together through a nearby park. The silence between them was comfortable, the breeze carrying the scent of flowers and freshly cut grass. They found a bench under the shade of a large tree and sat down. "How are you doing?" Rebecca asked, turning to him. "Better," Ethan answered honestly. "There are still hard days, but I think I'm starting to understand who I am. And to accept it." Rebecca nodded, pride shining in her eyes. "You've handled all of this with so much strength, Ethan. I don't know if I would have had the same courage." "I had help," he said, looking at her with a genuine smile. "I don't know what my life would be like now if you hadn't found me." Rebecca felt tears brimming, but not from sadness. "And I don't know how I would have moved forward without you. You've brought something I didn't even know was missing." Ethan remained silent for a moment before speaking again. "I'll always love Ellie. She was an incredible mom, and she always will be. But it's good to know I can have you in my life too. I didn't think I needed that, but now I wouldn't trade it for anything." Rebecca gently touched his shoulder, feeling a warmth and love she hadn't felt in a long time. "We're in this together. Always." Months had passed since that fateful day when Rebecca found Ethan selling roses at an intersection. From strangers disconnected by tragedy, they had become an unconventional but genuine family. It wasn't perfect, but it was what they needed. Together, they were learning to heal the wounds of the past and build something new. As they walked back home under the soft glow of the setting sun, Ethan glanced at Rebecca and, for the first time, felt whole. He had two mothers who had loved him in different ways, and now he had the chance to carry forward that legacy of love. And so, under the warm light of twilight, they kept walking, ready to face the future, together. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, leave a comment, and check out our next story.